Type it on Facebook. All right, go to Facebook now.
Natalie, I'll have to sit down with you eventually and get all of your tips and tutorials on this.
Oh, we'll have to invite the whole crew here because these guys have they've saved my little patootie quite a few times. So
yes, I would love that.
Imani, we actually have a video that we left up on Facebook that kind of details the accessibility and setup in Zoom. So it's on the African American Conference on Disabilities, and it's about, I don't know, 25 minutes long.
yeah.
But yeah, check that out. And we're learning as we go here as well. So thanks.
Yeah, it's awesome. It's really well run. So it's one of the better ones I've been in. So.
All right, we are going live.
There we go.
And we are live, friends.
Yes.
Okay, now.
Natalie, if you can go to that gear icon and toggle captions on.
That's where I'm going right now, sir.
Thank you.
Yep. And we are captioned.
And Crystal and Audrey, would you like for us to handle the spotlight back and forth again?
Yes, that would be great.
Okay, perfect. Who's up first?
I am up first.
Okay, perfect.
We have enough stuff to do.
No, it's perfect. We were getting the flow last time, so we'll be able to do that. For some reason, my Facebook Live isn't necessarily running right now. Does somebody else see it live?
Yeah, hold on.
Audrey says she can see it on Facebook.
Okay.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
Jeff just shared it, so I think.
Okay.
Yeah, it's running.
So what happened Tuesday as well? Mine took some time to go live for some reason. All right, Natalie, tell us when you're ready.
All right, we can go.
All right, folks, admitting all. Turning off the waiting room. Good morning, everyone. This is a great time to adjust your audio. We'll be starting in about 1 minute. Thank you for joining us today.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's session of the 2021 African American Conference on Disabilities. This is the second to last session. Can't believe it's February just flew by. So my name is Jeff Javier, and I'm with the University of Arizona Sonoran Center for Excellence in Disabilities. I'm here today with John McDermott from the Northern Arizona University Institute for Human Development, and we are the tech team behind the scenes today to help things run smoothly. Just a little Zoom housekeeping before we get started. This morning we have captioning provided by Marissa. To activate captions, please click on the live transcript button at the bottom of the meeting screen for caption options. Please note the full transcript view is now available as an option. If you are joining us via Facebook Live, you may also need to activate captions by clicking the gear icon at the bottom of the screen. And as a reminder to our speakers today, please speak a little slowly, slower than your normal pace so that our captioner can capture everything that's being said. We also have Audrey and Crystal as our ASL interpreters today. One way to see the ASL interpretation is to find the ASL interpreters in the participant list, and then right-click and select the pin video option for that person. This will allow you to keep the interpretation video front and center during the meeting. The host will also spotlight for everyone the active ASL interpreter, so it should automatically come to the front as well. The ASL, just so everyone knows, the ASL interpreters will be switching off during today's session. Feel free to change your view of today's session by clicking on the view button and switching between gallery view and speaker view to suit your preference. That view button is in the top right corner. And now I will pass it on to Natalie Luna Rose from the Arizona Center for Disability Law to introduce our topic and our speakers this morning. Natalie.
Thanks, Jeff. Good morning, everybody. I'm glad to have another session of our African American Conference on Disabilities. If this is your first time here, welcome. If you are joining us again, thank you for tagging along with us this month of February. We are at our second to last session. Our final session is tomorrow, 10 a.m. With Commissioner Thomas Hicks about voting rights in the disability community. So I think that will be a great session. We'll give a reminder when we are finished with today's session. And I'm going to thank our sponsors who have been with us this whole month of February, and we couldn't do what we're doing now without them. I'd like to thank Arizona Center for African American Resources, ASCAR, Valley Toyota Dealers, Arizona Developmental Disabilities Planning Council, Arizona Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, Sonoran USED at the University of Arizona, Institute for Human Development at NAU, Arizona Statewide Independent Living Council, Diverse Ability Incorporated, Marks the Spot Barbershop, Uniques Media, Valley of the Sun United Way, and the Arizona Center for Disability Law. So today's session, Protest Ensuring Accessibility in Social Justice Activities, is going to be hosted today by Imani Barwin, Disability Rights Pennsylvania, and Sai In, who is an attorney at ACDL. Both Imani, Sai, and myself, we work for protection and advocacy agencies for our states. And if you're not familiar with the P&As, each state and territory has one mandated by Congress. And what ACDL does and what Disability Rights Pennsylvania does, there's Disability Rights Texas and California, we all do the same in working to ensure the civil rights for people with disabilities. So I am going to turn it over to both Imani and Sai.
Thank you, Natalie. So, as Natalie said, my name is Sai In. I'm a staff attorney with the Arizona Center for Disability Law. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I am I'm a male, 30 years old, and I am wearing a blue button-up. Imani?
Hello, everyone. My name is Imani Barber, and as previously stated, I'm with Disability Rights Pennsylvania. I'm an African-American woman with blue shoulder-length dreadlocks, and I'm wearing a blue top today. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So this morning we're going to cover a couple of different things. First, we're going to define social justice activities. Then we're going to give you a brief history on protest within the disability and within the race context. Third, we're going to talk about the intersectionality of race and disability. Fourth, we're going to discuss strategies to improve accessibility. And five, we're gonna open it up for questions. So we're gonna leave the last 30 minutes of the presentation for questions. But in the meantime, feel free to drop questions in the chat box as they may come up. So when we're defining social justice activities, we're talking about two major spheres. So we're talking about in-person activities, and we're talking about a more virtual event and activities. So regarding in-person activities, we have protests and rallies. So these are the things that we traditionally think of when we think of social justice activities. So these are about coming together in a space, whether it's in person or virtual, to express your opinions, express your outrage about a particular action or inaction. And this coming together is with the hopes of effectuating some sort of change. And then we have sit-ins. So sit-ins are like a subset of protests. Sit-ins are sit-ins are where individuals occupy a designated space. There have been a number of examples of sit-ins throughout the years. I'll just give you one right now. For example, in 1935, the League of the Physically Handicapped in New York City had a sit-in against the Workers' Progress Administration, which was like a federal agency that was designed to help citizens get employment. What the WPA did was they stamped individuals who were physically handicapped with a PH stamp, which meant they were unemployable. So the league, in this case, organized the sit-in, and the sit-in eventually led to job creations and led to a repeal of that policy. And then you have political events. So political events can encompass a number of things. So I'm just going to list a couple of examples. They can encompass political rallies. They could include fundraising for your preferred politician, the politician that supports your social views. And it could also include lobbying legislatures for change. And then you have roundtable forums. Roundtable forums are where organizers invite individuals who have expertise to a roundtable to discuss social justice activities. Then you have volunteer work. Volunteer work can be a great form of social justice activities. That's where you can use your talents. For example, you could, if you had expertise in graphic design, you could create a website for your social justice activity. And then you have boycotts. So boycotts is a collective action to refuse to participate in a particular activity. So for example, back in 2017, there was Day Without Immigrants, where people took part to protest the border wall and deportation of undocumented immigrants. And of course, one of the most famous boycotts of all, the Montgomery bus boycott that lasted from 1955 to 1956, which protested the racial segregation of public transportation. And then you have virtual events. So a lot of in-person activities these days have a virtual corollary. So you have virtual protests, you have virtual political events, virtual fundraising events, and you have something that is pretty new within the past couple of years, where individuals have been using their social media presence to effectuate change.
Yeah, and I wanted to add one thing to the social media presence is that a lot of all of these in-person events can be replicated through social media. And we'll talk about that a little bit later.
So here is a brief history on protests. So you have your 504 protests and your Black Panther sit-ins in 1977. So in 1977, President Nixon had recently signed the Section 504 into law. And this was after him vetoing the bill, saying it would cost too much money. Section 504 forbids federal agencies and organizations receiving federal monies from excluding or denying individuals with disabilities an equal opportunity to receive program benefits and services. So the 504 regulations weren't really put into place yet. So you had the law, but you didn't have the regulations, and you didn't have any enforcement of it, which basically meant corporations, businesses, federal agencies could still discriminate against people with disabilities because there was a lack of enforcement. The 504, so because of this, frustrated disability rights advocates started protesting. It really started in San Francisco in the offices of the Health and Education and Welfare Department, their agency office in San Francisco, and it started to get some traction. Bradley Lomax, who is the gentleman who is pictured in this picture right here, he was one of the Black Panthers who helped bring these two communities together, the disability rights community and the Black community. And he helped bring awareness to disability rights issues, and the Black Panthers were really instrumental with the sit-ins and with the 504 protests. Then you have the Gang of 19 and ADAPT. So Colorado, in 1978, a group of individuals with physical disabilities threw themselves in front of the buses to protest lack of accessible transportation in the state. So images filled the media, and their mantra was, we will ride. So these images were really powerful, were visceral, and this led to eventually public buses that were accessible. In 1988, there was a protest called Deaf President Now. So there's a university in the US called Gallaudet University. The university has education and is geared mostly for individuals who are deaf and hard of hearing. In 1988, the board of directors decided to hire a non-deaf president, which outraged students, it outraged faculty, and it outraged many individuals who are deaf and hard of hearing. So the students pretty much shut down the campus, barricaded gates, and after unsuccessful meetings, the protests eventually grew, and the students were able to put pressure on the board of trustees and the board of directors, and that led to a new president being chosen, someone who is deaf. 1990, the Capitol crawl, quite possibly the most visible disability rights related protest in the US. So, and quite possibly the most documented. So over 1,000 people in this case marched from the White House to the Capitol demanding Congress pass the Americans with Disabilities Act. On that day, 60 of those protesters cast aside their wheelchairs and crawled up the Capitol steps, including 8-year-old Jennifer Keelan Chaffins. She said, "I felt that it was necessary to show the country what kinds of things people with disabilities have to face on a day-to-day basis." Within 4 months of the Capitol crawl, Congress passed the ADA, and President George H.W. Bush signed it into law, saying, "Let the shameful wall of exclusion finally come tumbling down." In 2020, you have the Women's March and the continuation of the Women's March. The Women's March has been going on for a couple years, but I included this example because back in 2019, a lot of a lot of disability rights advocates had been advocating for more inclusion of women who are trans, more inclusion of people with disabilities. And the Women's March took all of that into consideration and adopted policies to make their marches more inclusive. And some of the things that they do now in their marches are they organize an accessible van march that will take individuals who need assistance, and they will drop them off at an ADA tent. There's ADA seated sections during the march. Volunteers are provided with training. ASL interpreters are provided. CART captioning is provided, and there's just a more increased accessibility for people with disabilities. And then in 2020, we saw Black Lives Matters protests, and this was really a culmination of it's really a culmination of just a systemic racism from police departments, from cities, from counties. And all of this really started, well, not all started, but all of this started to brew back in 2013 with the acquittal of Trayvon Martin's murder. So we've all seen the names in the media. We've all seen individuals who have been racially profiled, racially affected by police action, and all of this led to a widespread national and global movement where the New York Times reported on June 6th, over 500,000 people turned out in nearly 550 places. Black Lives Matter leaders understand the need to be inclusive and understand the need to include individuals with disabilities in their planning throughout the protests, and they continue to do it now. And because of this, they've adopted policies like having ASL interpreters at events and making their protests more inclusive of people with disabilities. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Amani.
Thank you so much, Sai. So going off of what Sai said, a lot of disability and racial justice activism is part of the exact same goal. We need to stop thinking of them as separate issues. Okay, all justice movements require the inclusion of disability and the disability community because racism, systemic racism, environmental racism, medical racism, and even interpersonal racism all result in disability to some extent. Not only that, but we often erase the identities of people who are victims of this racism, who are Black or people of color. So, for instance, when we talk about Black Lives Matter and we talk about the high rate of killings of people with disabilities, it's something around 30 to 50%. Nobody really talks about the fact that Sandra Bland had epilepsy, or that Elijah McClain had the police called on him because he was anemic and was wearing a face mask prior to the pandemic. These are all things that are informed by disability, and if we are erasing them, we are not getting the whole story, and we are not validating the entire person. And we are also ignoring very, very real factors within our community. You know, there's a lot of communities that do not have accessibility, that are deprived of resources. But disability is so prevalent within racial minority communities that we'd rarely ever see it. And there are some cultural aspects to why disability is erased in a lot of minority communities that I won't really go too deep into. But we no longer have a choice about talking about disability and race within the same spectrum. As well as that, you know, transphobia and queerphobia in all its form also disable people and cut people off from medical care or their families or communities, and that causes mental health issues, other types of disabilities. So disability is not, inclusion of the disability community is a necessity and not an ask. We are no longer asking to be included. You have to include us. It is imperative that we are part of whatever narrative you are hoping to share with your group, with your movement, and the stories that validate and personalize your movement. Next slide, please. So like I said before, what are the stakes? People with disabilities span every race, gender, sexual orientation, but are erased in nearly every single conversation, especially disabled people of color. Again, I am a disabled Black woman, and it is very rare that I go into Black-led spaces where disability is talked about at all. And that is not acceptable to me. And I think that we can do better by one another. Systemic oppression such as racism, police violence, systemic and environmental and medical racism all lead to disability. Like I've said before, these systems that we are fighting against all lead to disability. When somebody is harmed and they are left with lifelong effects of it, that's a disability. And simply ignoring the disabilities within ourselves in order to not be a part of that larger conversation, that's also unacceptable. If you have a disability, if you have illnesses, please take your seat at the table and discuss it. Let's come together. Let's make sure that we're validating one another and making sure that we are telling the stories that need to be told, that we are no longer isolating one another because of the fears of what white supremacy places on our bodies. We cannot appease white supremacy. We cannot appeal to it. Claiming your disability does not make you less than in their eyes. It does not matter. You have to form community regardless. Ableism, or the interpersonal and structural bias that favors non-disabled bodies, has roots in every form of discrimination, and unpacking how it affects your members and advocates can create a more inclusive environment. I sincerely believe that ableism has its tentacles in every single form of bigotry in this country, if not globally. Race science was the idea of using clinicians and medical jargon to diagnose Blackness and indigenous features and body types as a disability. That is not a mistake. And we see those ripple effects today. We see people, a lot of the dog whistles for racism sound a lot like ableism. We talk, the stereotype of Black people as angry and aggressive. That's a dog whistle for emotional regulation disabilities. When we talk about women being less than and fragile and frail, those are also physical disabilities. When we talk about when people stereotype queer people and trans people as sick, that they're desiring to treat them like they have a disability. So like I've said before, every single form of bigotry has some rooted ableism within it. Because when we assign disability to minority groups, what happens is we make them disposable. We make them disposable because we treat disabled people like they are disposable. So it makes it easier for white supremacy to marginalize those groups and to make that mental leap. Okay. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about the Communications of Intersectionality. I am a communications director, so it is incredibly important to me that we talk about storytelling and how we get together and how we gather, and not only just those stories that are being told, but how we tell them. Next slide, please. So one of the very first things you do as a movement leader is to affirm the diversity of your community and your allies. You never want to think of it as just an us versus them. There are so many allies and diversity within your own group that you need to affirm. Because what this does is, for anybody who's looking in on your group thinking it's not for them, they may be able to pinpoint somebody who with an experience that is similar to their own and engage in your greater message, more so than if they were to see just a homogenous group of people. So embrace the diversity within your group. One of the simplest ways, like I said, to show the breadth and power of your collective action is to affirm the other identities of those you're collaborating with. Are there queer people in your group? Are there disabled people? Are there trans people? Are there, people who are poor or, college educated? Show the diversity of who you're with. Understanding the language of intersectionality is just as important as understanding the intention behind it. Affirm people's pronouns, affirm people's sexual orientation, provide quiet spaces if somebody is neurodivergent, things like that. Next slide, please. So prepping your intersectional communications. What I always do when I'm starting a movement, I try to ask for stories, because those are easy pieces to create social change via social media. So collect stories. Make sure you are asking for and affirming people's pronouns and how they identify socially. So for instance, I am a Black, queer, disabled woman, and I like to go by that. And a lot of people also use these identifiers and can find me through them. So again, that's another point of contact for your mission and group. Like I've said before, ask for stories about how your mission interacts with their other identities. One of the methods that I like to use for storytelling and advocacy is a triangle method, which is I try to address two main questions. Whenever I talk about my personal issues as a disabled person, people ask me, people will say to me, well, that's just you. That's just you. You know what? It's just your problem. But then I like to branch it out into the systemic issues. My personal story is just one point. Let's look at some of the systemic statistics and how it is informing my own personal issues. So ask for stories about how your mission interacts with other identities. How does climate change affect queer people? How does climate change affect disabled people? Um, how does wealth distribution affect disabled people? What does it mean that we want to raise the minimum wage? Are disabled people included in that, who are allowed to be paid below the minimum wage in 38 states? Just ask how larger policies affect the individual, and give them space to tell their story. So this is another tactic that I like to use, which is treat each person involved like an influencer who could speak to the unique experience of their community. I don't know who here, if you can put it in the chat, who here is familiar with Stacey Abrams? You can react or put your hand up. Right. So one of the things that Stacey Abrams did extremely well was that she basically used what is called a micro-influencing platform. She wasn't going for large names or huge, people with large followings to discuss and to advocate for her goal. She was basically using people with smaller groups of people that trusted the individual. So for instance, think of it like a Tupperware party, right? If you are someone who has a community where you have like 5 to 10 friends, those 5 to 10 friends may trust you better than if you had a million friends, right? They may interact with you more because they trust you and can see you and talk to you and interact with you on a more personal level. So think of people in your group like that as well. Allowing them to tell their stories brings them to the smaller communities who are otherwise ignored and left unreached. Okay. And then make sure leaders and collaborators make sure leaders give collaborators the space to correct them when leaders are wrong. This is another pitfall that I see in a lot of social justice movements, is that because we are fighting for social justice or a specific goal, we think that our leaders are beyond reproach. They're not. They are people. They may be leading, they may be, sometimes they may be the face of the movement, but they are not beyond reproach. Some people need to be corrected. We have people that come from very different backgrounds, so they may not always have the language to speak to your particular movement, but give them the space and the grace to be corrected by the people you want to work with. Otherwise, you will alienate others. Okay, next slide.
So I'm going to talk about strategies to improve accessibility in physical in-person spaces. And then Amani is going to discuss strategies for virtual spaces. So first off, it's really important, like Amani said earlier, to develop a communication plan. So this plan is both internal and external. And in this communication plan, it's of utmost importance to avoid ableist language. So what do I mean by ableist language? So ableism is the discrimination of social prejudice against people with disabilities based on the belief that typical abilities are superior. And it's toxic, it's not inclusive, it's a horrible thing to do. It comes about from attitudes, stereotypes, or an outright offensive comment or behavior. And you can do a quick Google search of ableist language or things to avoid saying, and basically like no words, like things, words and phrases you should not use when drafting your communication plan. The second thing is plan for effective communication, and this includes auxiliary aids and services. So this includes ASL interpreters. It can also include certified deaf interpreters. It can also include CART captioning. So many people, there is a stereotype that if you're hard of hearing or deaf, then you automatically know ASL, and so ASL should be enough. But that's rarely the case, because hard of hearing individuals, they could develop their that disability later on in life, and they might not have the ASL proficiency. So having captioning at your events is a great tool for being more inclusive and providing the necessary accommodations. Schedule intermittent breaks. So individuals with physical disabilities might need to take breaks during marches, during protests. So it's always a great plan and a great way to be more inclusive. Peacekeeper training. So peacekeepers are designated individuals who are designed to keep the peace. These are intermediaries. They act as a buffer between protesters and law enforcement or anti-protesters. They're there to diffuse the situation if it gets too hostile, if it gets too aggressive. And a great way to be more inclusive is to have peacekeeper training. Have a primer on disability-related issues for these peacekeepers. An example could be a protester who is deaf gets affronted by a police officer. The protester starts using sign language. The police officer views it as aggressive behavior and may take action against the protester, when in fact the protester most likely is trying to convey that he or she or they are deaf. So having a peacekeeper kind of be an intermediary, kind of step in, trying to diffuse the situation, could de-escalate tensions. You also want to identify your site. So whether it's a roundtable, whether it's a rally, whether it's a protest or sit-in, you want to survey your space. So plan ahead. Some site locations are symbolic, like federal buildings, locations where instance of discrimination occurred. So it might be hard to plan around that, but you should always try to plan ahead and identify locations that have paved roads, have smooth surfaces, have park benches or seating for individuals, have areas where you can partition off for designated rest spaces. You also want to plan around transportation. So lots of people, including individuals with disabilities, rely on public transportation, especially in the context of protests, because if you're going to a site with a large number of people, parking is going to be inaccessible. It's going to be difficult. So people rely on public transportation. So choose a location that is accessible to the subway lines or bus lines or light rails or things like that. Offer accommodations. So if you can, if your organization is able to provide loaner wheelchairs, see if you can partner with third-party organizations who are able to facilitate this, to provide these loaner wheelchairs. Again, set up designated rest spaces, and set up first aid stations, stations where individuals can treat their wounds if they come across aggressive behavior, treat their tear gas or pepper spray. So set up first aid stations would really help individuals. And plan ahead. And when you are planning, make sure you include individuals with disabilities in the planning, because individuals with disabilities have firsthand experience. They know these issues. They have a perspective that should be included and that should be heard. And it's just the best practice. Think of accessibility like a menu that individuals can choose from. So rather than one or two options. So your goal is to always try to be as accessible as possible. And this can come in through providing quiet spaces, accessible entrances, ASL, American Sign Language, or BASL, Black American Sign Language. Just a quick note. So American Sign Language, there are often regional dialects or regional differences when you're communicating through ASL. So providing like maybe an interpreter from that particular community can help facilitate effective communication. If you're printing out materials, if you're posting on social media, provide image descriptions, also known as alt text or alternative text. So if you take a screenshot of something and the screenshot has text, screen readers, people who rely on screen reading technology to read whatever's on like a phone or a computer screen, those screen readers are unable to read the text. So if you have a description and if you have alternative text, that makes your communications more accessible. Have captions, like I said before, cart captioning will provide greater accessibility for people who aren't necessarily fluent in ASL but are fluent in written English. Have transcripts of events, and create an accessible evacuation plan in case something happens. And these are some just additional tips. So plan for, like we said before, plan for breaks if it's needed. For individuals, bring a friend. A friend will promote accountability, or a friend can help keep track. Friends can help keep track of one another. Go at your own pace. And again, plan in case of a medical emergency. Make sure you have medication on hand. Make sure you know the quickest route to the closest hospital. And make sure you have like a printed, maybe a wallet size cutout of any like known allergies. So that could help for individuals. Bring masks and eyewear. Of course, we're in the age of COVID-19, so it's not hard to bring masks, but masks may help with protecting against chemical irritants from like tear gas and from pepper spray. Eyewear also helps if you have safety goggles that could help with pepper spray. And also, I read somewhere that it's useful to not wear contacts. If you're a contact wearer, not to wear contacts and instead wear eyeglasses, because the chemical irritants can often get trapped under your contacts. And then, of course, bring a bag of essentials, snacks, water, medication, anything that you think you will need during the day. And I'm going to turn it back over to Amani.
Hello, everyone. So some of you may know me as Crutches and Spice, and so I love a good social media movement and virtual access to in-person spaces. So creating a virtual arm of an in-person collective action is an excellent way to allow those unable to attend personally to become involved in your action and mission. Another reason for this is that since having just volume of social media interactions can bring attention to your mission and get more people involved in what you're doing. People can participate in an awareness campaign, and boosting campaign from home and aid in the visibility of your activism. A lot of people really discount the power of social media, and particularly disability advocates who spend a lot of their time advocating via social media. A lot of times people think of it as quote unquote slacktivism, but in a lot of ways, this is the only way a lot of disabled people can participate and have their voices heard. I like to use Crip the Vote as a perfect example of this. So around 2015, 2016, Crip the Vote was started by Alice Wong, Andrew Pulrang, and Greg Baratan. And they were really focused on getting disabled people involved in the political sphere. Because not only was voting inaccessible, but a lot of the topics being talked about completely ignored the disability community, right? And so between the 2016 election and the 2020 election, the rate of disabled people voting increased by about 20%. That is a huge jump, a huge, huge jump. And we can chalk that up to not only just social media movements, but us pushing for accessibility via those social media movements, as well as, in some ways the pandemic made voting the most accessible it's ever been. So when we talk about social movements and how they are formed in online spaces, we really have to take into account the work of disabled people. And it is extremely important to plan ahead to make the most of your activism on the ground. A hashtag campaign is an excellent avenue towards such participation. Quite literally every single in-person event that you've seen discussed here today can be replicated for a digital event campaign as well. And adding to it and combining a digital campaign with an in-person campaign can make eyes direct to you and your mission. Next slide, please. So I'm always really game for creating a hashtag. It's kind of like a folder or a bookmark. So for those who don't know what a hashtag is, it's basically like a bookmark on a conversation or a moment. It allows you to come back to it, to find other people who are talking about the same thing, to make sure that people are finding one another and the resources they need. If you're particularly advocating for a certain group of people who may need assistance. So launching a hashtag for a collective action is an effective way to consolidate communications and draw attention to your mission. Recognizing an opportunity and crafting messaging. A hashtag should generally be under 40 characters and be specific enough to be applicable to the community you're hoping to engage, but general enough that others feel invited and tell their own stories. The first letter of every word in your hashtag should be capitalized. For example, Black Lives Matter with Black BLM capitalized. That makes it easier for screen readers to read. You don't want a hashtag that is so long and so involved that people forget to get tripped up along the way, because there will be typos, there will be misspellings, and then you'll basically divide the attention based on how somebody misspelled a hashtag. So keep it short, keep it simple, but keep it specific enough to what you're doing and who you hope to reach. Yes, Dis in Higher Ed, Sarita. Hopefully the hashtag you will create will be original enough to have never been used before. This is also very important because you don't want it to be, you don't want to, divide attention between subject matter to make sure that people are directly involved with what you're talking about. So for instance, something like higher ed is so vast of a hashtag, it would never gain too much attention unless it was combined with a specific topic in higher ed, if that makes sense. So I like to schedule my tweets like the introductory. I like to schedule my tweets like introductory tweets to introducing people to the movement, introducing people to the idea of the campaign, making sure that they know who's to talk to if they need help. I always like to also make sure that there's a point person, especially if there is an in-person action being coordinated with a digital action. And you'll understand why in a couple minutes. So you want to schedule your tweets that model your idea format ahead of time to launch the hashtag. So I launched the hashtag Ableds are weird a little while ago, and I created a couple of tweets within the hour, emulating the model that I hoped other disabled people could replicate to tell their own stories. That's important. You want to set the example, the tone of which you want to set for other people. It's also important to schedule any fundraising tweets under the hashtag ahead of time to make sure that it is a little bit easier and spread out to use so that people during different times of the day get to see the exact same fundraising campaigns. Do I feel Hootsuite is more accessible than TweetDeck? I feel as though both of those are a pain in the behind. Hootsuite has a lot of issues when it comes to alt text because it doesn't really plug in very well to a lot of the other platforms. But TweetDeck doesn't allow you to schedule video, so it's kind of 6 in one hand, half a dozen the other. I recommend Hootsuite for if you're doing it across platforms. So if you're using a hashtag on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, you could schedule all those tweets at the same time. I recommend TweetDeck if you're sticking mostly just to Twitter. But again, if you're doing any sort of videos, you have to have those done ahead of time, and you need to be posting those in person throughout the day. So again, schedule your tweets. You'll want to use Hootsuite's. You're going to want to schedule them at least 10 minutes apart during the first 2 hours of your launch, and then schedule at least 15 to 20 posts from that time period. The first post should be a call for others to participate, as well as examples about how to work it, how to use the hashtag. Next slide, please. So virtual spaces, visual assets. So visual pieces of media like photos, videos, tweets, fleets. There's a lot of different names for the same exact crap. So visual assets are incredibly important, not only because they will draw people to the movement, but because they are favored by social media algorithms. And likewise, utilizing new functions like Reels on Instagram or Fleets on Twitter can bump the visibility of your content as a platform advertises new features heavily as they're being launched. So this is one of the big secrets of social media. So I don't know if you've ever seen like a random person with like 5 million followers on Instagram. The reason why it's just a random person with that many followers is because they're an early adopter. What they do is they go into a platform, they use a feature that is brand new and that the platform is advertising and boosting in its algorithm, and they gain a lot of views and a lot of followers because the platform wants more people to see that new feature on their app. So it's a good way of doing those things. So right now on Instagram, Reels are very, very popular. You can get a lot of views on the same content that you post as photos if you just sit in front of a camera and explain what you're talking about. So that's a good way of doing things. You also want to create several different forms of the exact same information. Create a video, create a picture, create a reel, making sure that you're utilizing as many different formats of the exact same material so that people can absorb it in the way that is best for them. With that in mind, you need to make it accessible. That is not That is not negotiable. It has to be accessible. You will need alt text for photos. Image descriptions and captions should be curated for content before any in-person activity. A good tip that I like to use is going back to the Hootsuite versus TweetDeck. With image descriptions, you will want to use those more so in Instagram. Instagram's alt text feature does not work properly with all screen readers. So it's best to put it in the caption. And whenever I'm sending out media to other people that I want them to share, I always include alt text. So let's take an example. Let's say that somebody is on their, has sunglasses on and they're using a cell phone, a smartphone. Now, if this is a sunglasses campaign, it would read something like so-and-so in our new sunglasses using their phone, right? But if it's for a person with a disability, that may be a blind person using a cell phone. So those are two different connotations to the exact same image. So you'll want to give people suggestions on alt text because you don't want them confusing your message because they interpreted the photo differently than you intended it to be interpreted. Okay. Again, these should all be done ahead of time, and you could send them out to the stakeholders that you want to use them. They should also be succinct. A lot of people who use screen readers have reported back that some people make their image descriptions way too involved. Like they're sitting on the screen reader reading the image behind it, reading the text behind the image, and it's so distracting that they don't really get to the heart of the content. So make it succinct, make it easy to absorb, and so they can get directly to your message. And then accurately portray the media being shared. Do not put anything in alt text or image descriptions that are not there. Okay. Do not try to game Google SEO to get more people. Just describe what's there. Be as accommodating to the person using that technology more so than your desire to be boosted through Google or Google search. Next slide, please. So you always want to time your digital action extremely carefully. If you notice, any sort of hashtag that I like to launch is usually on either at the start of the weekend or during the weekend. This is because weekends are extremely slow news cycles, at least before a certain Twitter user. They used to be very slow news, a news cycle. So that could be difficult to do in today's news cycle. I choose weekends and in the morning because rarely does political news happen over the weekend. When journalists pitch stories on their Monday meetings, they generally choose things that have trended over social media over the weekend. This is kind of like using the 24-hour news cycle against people. And it makes it a little bit easier for you to get some media attention to your mission as the week starts and people are using social media over the weekend and then going into their Monday meetings to pitch a story. Okay, next slide, please. So I listed some resources here to make content accessible. So the W3C has an entire page on their website about accessibility web standards. This is great if you want to make your website and content accessible, as well as, any social media should bring people back either to a mission or to your website or to where they can find you. So making sure that you're scheduling tweets along your hashtag movement that bring people back to your original mission or bring them back to where they can find more information. And you can also look at the University of Rochester social media guide. They also have a really good guide on alt text and making sure social media is accommodating. And then Rooted in Rights, I just can't sing their praises enough. They are technically a part of the P&A system. I've worked with them before on the Vote for Access series. Every single piece of media, they really carefully evaluate to make sure it's accessible. And they created an entire accessibility guide for social media, visual content, videos, Zoom calls, literally everything you could think of. So I always highly recommend them as a good resource for making your content accessible. Next slide. So, Sai, did you want to do the key takeaways?
Sure, I can do that. So,
Sure.
so again, so we're all in this together. We need each other. Disability rights and racial advocacy requires collaboration across marginalization and this has this collaboration, as you've seen before, as I said before, like with Bradley Lomax and the Black Panthers and the 504 sit-ins, the collaboration works. And when you have groups of people coming together and advocating with each other, for each other, being inclusive of each other, you can produce really good results. All justice movements must be intersectional. You must include voices and communities. Nothing is monolithic. Nothing is just disability rates. Nothing is just race rates. Everything has intersectionality. Everything has multiple populations involved. In creating a robust social media arm, going along with any in-person action really makes things inclusive for people who are unable to participate in in-person events. And we've definitely seen this during the 2020 Black Lives Matters protests because of COVID restrictions and because of COVID generally, individuals weren't really able to leave their home because they were afraid of getting the virus, becoming sick and spreading the virus. So individuals were forced to weigh their options and balance things out. And luckily, a lot of influencers, a lot of organizers created a virtual platform that went along with the in-person arm to make things accessible and inclusive. And we thank you. We thank you for being a part of this presentation. We thank you for letting us discuss these ideas, these strategies with you, and we hope we can work and collaborate with you in the future. And with that, we are going to turn it over to our question and answer portion.
Thanks, Sai. So we had a really great discussion. We had lots of activity in the chat, so thank you. I will agree with Poppy presenters. This session was fire. I think I can't disagree with that. So I'll start with a few questions here. So much fire, yes. Amani, what factors do you feel have led to some justice movements not using intersectional approach, including disability? I have felt excluded by the BSU on my campus, and I don't tend to engage anymore with them.
Yeah, so I mentioned it a little bit earlier about some of the cultural context around disability. And it's a hard line to walk because you feel like you don't want to take it personally, but it is very personal to us. And at the same time, there is a historical reason why there's exclusion of disability from racial justice spaces. And that has a lot to do with, like that historical correlation between ableism and racism. Ableism was used to justify racism. So what I would say is that, tell them that if you are advocating for Black Lives Matter, if you are advocating for police police reform and things like that, that you need to include disability. It is not negotiable. These are not separate fights. When we talk about the high prevalence of people with disabilities killed by police, we talk about Sandra Bland had epilepsy, and like I said, Elijah McClain, and people who are becoming disabled because of police violence, like Blake. They need to incorporate it because it's not accessible. It's not acceptable to ignore us. And I'm so sorry that you feel excluded by your BSU. I know that that's not easy. I've experienced that myself. But I would create my own group if I could, and make sure that you are inclusive of Black, Indigenous, and people of color with disabilities. If your BSU does not want to move the mark and be more inclusive.
Thank you. Next question. How do you handle people with deeply held religious beliefs regarding sexuality issues?
Wow, that's a real good question. And I think to start off, I would invite them into the community. I would see if they were open to being a part of conversations. Perhaps they can join in on some meetings. Maybe when COVID is over and in-person meetings can happen again, you can bring those individuals into these meetings to get other perspectives, to talk with other people in the community. There are also a lot of stories. Influencers have been using YouTube and other forms of social media to share their stories. So maybe you can share really powerful videos and stories that resonate with you and that you identify with to those to whoever you're trying to educate and inform.
Going off of that, I would say that, like Sai was saying, a robust storytelling campaign is incredibly important to any movement. You can give people the statistics, you can give people the facts, you can give people all the information that you want to, but if they're not connecting to an individual, if they're not connecting to a person on a human level, all those numbers will mean nothing. So that's storytelling is incredibly important to any sort of social movement that you do.
Thank you. Are there colors that should be avoided when creating content on social media for screen readers?
Sure. So the resource Amani shared earlier links to best practices, and it's called the WCAG, and it will tell you like what sort of contrast you need. Uh, Generally you want contrasting colors that pair well together, like black and white, or like a navy blue and like a soft color. You wouldn't necessarily want like yellow and white to go together. You also want to avoid too many colors because that could conflict with one another. There's also a website, I'm going to look for it now, that will check your contrast accessibility. So if you post something online, you can refer whatever you've posted online or you can connect it to this website, and the website will analyze it for you to determine whether the contrast ratio is appropriate. And I'm going to look for it right now.
Another thing to do is, as well as, if you're building a website, you can create a toggle for people to change the contrast of the website so that it's easier for them to read. And this is more for people with dyslexia and difficulties reading text in general. You can have them create their own kind of contrast that works best for them on their website. On your website. So that's also another tool that you can have your programmer, if you have the time and money to do so, your programmer do for you.
Thank you. So we have some good links in the chat that was shared during the presentation, and links to the today's presentation also in Google Drive and Dropbox link. If you can't seem to get them there, you can also email me. It's easier if you can download from there, please do so, just so my inbox does not get blown up, but if you cannot, I'm putting my email in the chat box now, and I'm happy to send it to you. And the recording will be posted on our website after the conference, so sometime next week. It is also going to be on Facebook on our African American Conference for Disabilities Facebook page. Valerie Lewis asked, is there a monthly meeting to discuss these type of issues? And I don't know if Amani or
Oh,
Simon.
I mean, I don't know. I don't really know of any meeting to discuss any of these types of issues, but I know that if you follow people like Alice Wong by Alyssa Thompson, they all have good resources on intersectionality, disability, as well as accessibility. Another resource that I can probably give you is called the Disabled List. They basically work in digital spaces and accessibility. They are run by disabled people for disabled people, and they have really great resources and advocates there that may be able to help you out. It's the disabledlist.com.
Thank you. We still have some time, so if there's any, are there any other questions for Amani or Sai?
Natalie, earlier on in the chat, someone had shared another conference for this weekend, and it was the African American Center for Health. Wondering if that individual wants to post something in the chat for the free and open to public conference coming up this weekend.
Sure. Thank you for that, John. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is that there is a survey being conducted as part of the NIH-funded study to understand pregnancy experiences of deaf and hard of hearing women. It is a collaboration between Brandeis University and the University of Michigan. And they are looking for participants. And I will post the link to that survey. And if you have any questions about it, you can also email me as well. I will put both of these here in the chat. All right, next question. How would I introduce to advocate for inclusion in the agency where I work? I work for a Center for Independent Living.
So I would start off by building allies in the organization. So identifying individuals who you feel would be responsive to what you're suggesting, would be responsive to your ideas, and collaborating with these individuals. When you build allies, you build numbers, and you can take those numbers to leadership, and you can ask for a meeting and invite multiple people, invite all stakeholders to the meeting. So you get a wide variety of perspectives, and you get everyone at the table who is able to discuss the topics.
Thank you, Sai. Amani, there is a question that somebody wanted to get your contact information. So maybe you try Londa Whitus. Maybe you want to either, you want to put your information out on the chat or privately reach out to them. Brittany Wilson asks, how did you get started in advocacy? Do you have any tips to get started?
I think I was dragged. No, I think I was dragged via, inaccessibility. I think that one of the things about advocacy, I didn't set out to do this professionally. This was more, this was a path that I didn't see coming in a lot of ways. And I think that when it comes to advocacy, the best way I've seen for people who set out to do advocacy is to volunteer. Or to, be on a advisory committee. I know that there's a lot of different groups that you can, collaborate with and be a part of. And that's kind of the best way to do so, is to just, donate your time, or to ingrain yourself with somebody who's already in, or a group that's already a part of that realm of advocacy that you want to be a part of. You know, for instance, we have a mental health advisory council for my job. And that's a good way to get involved, because you learn about more issues within the disability. You can start advocating on behalf of those as well. So as long as you get your foot in the door, you're on your way, to be honest.
That's great suggestions. Thank you. Okay, do we have any more questions in the chat? Is there a printout of the Disparities in Disability Service for People of Color that could be used to help facilitate open discussion?
So off the top of my head, I can't think of any, but I know statistics and printouts are available. I think if you can research the National Council on Disability, they're a federal agency. They might have statistics and numbers regarding race and disability. You can also look to like think tanks. Think tanks also will aggregate the data, will put out like a published report of the data. I can't think of any off the top of my head, but those would be where I would start off with first.
Yeah, I would start with somebody like the Center for American Progress. They have a disability justice initiative. So they have a lot of data and articles on a lot of the different issues affecting the disability community. And then you can search their sources through those articles. That's usually a good way to kind of get that data. I know the CDC does racial data, disability by race data. I don't know if there's anything about services on those. But what you could perhaps do is kind of overlay racial data with, care organizations and like where they're located. So that might be a good way to kind of combine data as well to find the answers you're looking for.
Thank you. All right, any more questions? We still have a little bit of time. If not, we can wrap up and see if Sai or Amani have any final words.
I don't have too many final words other than thank you all for having me. I really appreciate getting the opportunity to be a loudmouth for disability justice and inclusion. So thank you so much. Somebody asked me, what advocate work are you most passionate about right now? Well, I mean, I think one of the things that that is most urgent right now is COVID and vaccinations, and that's day-to-day life or death for a lot of people in the disability community, as well as investing in community-based living, because we've seen some devastation in nursing homes across the country. So that's kind of, I don't know if I would say I'm passionate about it. I think it's just the most urgent right now.
I have to agree with Amani. Vaccines and prioritization of vaccines for those who need it, especially like individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, individuals with underlying medical conditions. Those are really those are populations that need vaccine prioritization. I'm also focused on issues affecting the deaf and hard of hearing and the deaf-blind community. So effective communication, advocacy between like healthcare providers and the deaf and hard of hearing communities is definitely a priority. And I'm also involved in something called supported decision making. So supported decision making is an alternative to guardianship. So our supported decision-making bill just passed the House yesterday. It was unanimously passed. So it's going over to the Senate. So I'm just going to do a quick plug real quick. So Arizonans out there who are interested in supported decision making and alternatives to supported decision making, I urge you to contact your senators to pass the bill.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Sai. Okay, I think we still have a few more we've got some questions coming in. Okay, we'll go back here. How do you hope that COVID-19 can be a catalyst of positive impact and advocacy around disability?
So I think personally, I think that with COVID-19, a lot of disability related issues are coming to the forefront, and the media is really picking up on these disability related issues. For one thing, you have triaging of care, which means if you're a hospital or a healthcare provider and you only have, say, X amount of ventilators, how do you identify those individuals who get ventilators? It's a tricky issue, and people with disabilities often are overlooked or often neglected because they're seen as people with lower qualities of life, which is abhorrent. It's awful. It's terrible, and it's an opportunity for us as disability rights advocates to inform healthcare providers and have these discussions with them to talk about healthcare related issues. And then there's vaccines. Like, we're going back to vaccines for a second. Identifying those groups of individuals with disabilities who need vaccines now, and creating the prioritization now will help with future healthcare outcomes. Like, if we have another pandemic, we'll already have a system in place and processes in place to make sure individuals with disabilities are taken care of and are treated in an equitable fashion.
Yeah, going off of what Sai said, I think that the entire pandemic response has been informed by ableism, and people have no choice. You can't ignore it anymore. I mean, we started off the pandemic in this country with people being told that only disabled and elderly people would die from this virus, and people thought, okay, that's fine. I'm okay with that risk. I'm okay with doing whatever I want as long as it's just the people that are quote unquote disposable who are affected. And ableism is not something we can escape. It affects everyone. Your ability is not promised and very much so predicated upon the behaviors of everybody around you. And disability is going to inform the future, because this is not just a mass death event. This is a mass disabling event. People will walk away from this virus with disabilities they've never had before. The systems they're not prepared to interact with the systems of support. The capacity for those systems of support. We don't know just how many people would need support going forward. And then there's the fact that, there's an entire racial uprising happened that also, creates disability. People were shot in the eye with rubber bullets are now blind. There are people who shot by police who are now disabled. So this entire era is informed by disability. And so I think that I would hope people have a long memory for the era that we're currently living in. The accessibility became really easy to get as soon as non-disabled people needed it. The accommodations were all of a sudden prevalent. I think one of the most devastating messages I ever got was from a 17-year-old who told me that a month before the pandemic happened, they dropped out of school because their school refused to make accommodations to telecommute to school, only for a month later for everybody to be using work from home and education from home programs. They gave up their entire educational career because of inaccessibility, only for it to turn on a dime less than a month later because non-disabled people needed it. So I would hope, like I said before, that people have a long memory for this era. I don't have a lot of confidence in that belief, but I think that it's no longer optional for people to think of disability as just a us versus them or us helping them formula. This is your future too. All of the barriers and stereotypes that you reinforce when you're non-disabled are waiting for you if you ever become disabled. So the clock is ticking. You don't have time.
Thank you, Amani. I think that was very powerful. I'm going to end with one last question. What is the primary resource for workforce and employment trajectory trends for people with disabilities?
The Bureau of Labor Statistics. That's where usually I find it. And yeah, that's usually where I find a lot of my data for disability and employment. If you're looking for easier to digest data, Disability Scoop does really good reporting on disability and politics, and they're a really excellent resource. I use them for kind of filler social media all the time, but they're really good on reporting.
And I will second Disability Scoop. I use them as well. So, okay, so I think with that, we're going to wrap up for the day. We have one last session tomorrow, and to register, John just put the link there. We hope you make it. Tomorrow's session will be the role and impact of voters with disabilities and people of color on the outcome of the 2020 general election with Thomas Hicks, Commissioner, U.S. Election Assistance Commission out of Washington, D.C. He's been at our conference before and always gives some great information. So we can hope you can make it to that. And we do have a survey. If you had not seen the link, I don't know if John or somebody can pull up the link real quick because I don't think I still have it in. Oh, there it is. Jeff did it. Thank you. You can fill out today's link to fill out your thoughts on today's survey. And thank you, Amani and Sai. Great session. Thank you to Audrey and Crystal for interpreting today and Marissa for captioning. I did see some another comment about where these presentations will be located. All presentations from the month of February will be on our website, hopefully sometime up next week, and emails will go out to all participants. So then you can go back and take a look at what, if you missed previous sessions. They're also on our Facebook page as well, recordings of all sessions. So with that, I bid you adieu and a good day, and we will see you all soon. Oh yes, and thank you to all our sponsors. Very much appreciated.